Okay, so I think I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural SP2 Speaker Series. If you don't know me, I'm Ezekiel Dixon-Roman, faculty here in the School of Social Policy and Practice. This speaker series was developed by the Dean's Office as part of SP2's new Action SP2 initiative, as well as in partnership with the Social Welfare Program's Pro Seminar. Action SP2 is a new initiative that, in Dean Jackson's words, aims to provide students with tangible examples of how to translate their goals into social interventions that matter. Through formal and informal conversations / workshops with local, national, and international organizers, policymakers, advocates, and activists, students will learn the nuts and bolts of what it takes to make social action concrete and successful. Thus, through the SP2 Speaker Series, we seek to feature some of the exciting and innovative social policy and social welfare research going on here in the School of Social Policy and Practice. The Speaker Series will have several exciting talks throughout the year, one per month. The next one will be next month, October, and of course I'm not going to remember the exact date off the top of my head. If you have not seen the actual full schedule, it will be, I'm sure, disseminated around again, and you'll also be seeing flyers throughout campus. So I encourage you all to come and make and check out each of the future talks. Today, we have the honor to hear from Professor Mark Stern. Professor Stern is the Kenneth L. M. Prey Professor of Social Policy and History, the co-director of Penn's Urban Studies program, and the principal investigator of the Social Impact of the Arts Project. He will be giving a talk today on culture and social well-being in New York City, concepts and methods. And without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Professor Stern.
Thanks, Ezekiel. You know, I should point out, actually, I'm no longer the Prey Professor. That's been passed to Phyllis Solomon, who I was thrilled to see succeed me in that. You know, it was interesting. When I said I'd do this lecture, I realized that although this project started in 1994 because of a grant from SP2, that I don't think I've ever presented kind of at a public forum within the school, you know, which underlines John Jackson's point that we really do need to do something to kind of build up scholarly conversation within the school. Now, ironically, for the members of the faculty, the email in which he asked requests for this said that the notion was to give newer professors and ones who don't have regular connections with the doctoral students an opportunity. And since I think I've worn out the welcome of most of the PhD students in the program already, and I'm not really one of the newer professors here. But anyway, I hope to hold up my end on this. So let me talk a little bit about where this came from. So Susan Seifert, who's in the back, and I have been doing this research on the social impact of the arts since, as I said, the 1990s. We had a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts and some foundations to do preliminary work on the connection between culture and social well-being in Philadelphia. And we did a pilot project based on that. And then we followed that with, we got some foundation funding to try it out in a couple of other cities. And you know, Sue and I had a total plan. We were going to go to Seattle and all these cities we dreamed to visit during the summer. But unfortunately, in the midst of that, one of our friends got appointed Commissioner of Cultural Affairs to New York City. And I would say, I'll use the word encouraged. Somehow I ended up with a twisted arm, but it was encouraged for us to take on New York City, which in retrospect was a totally insane idea. But one of the things that complicated it was the city council, around the same time we agreed to do this, had authorized the department to do a cultural plan for the city, which had to be finished by July 2017. So in addition to taking on a project that was way too big for our research group, we also had a deadline that was impossible. So anyway, I have a clicker. So here's kind of our basic claim out of the project, which is essentially that arts and culture can have a demonstrated connection to various dimensions of social well-being, but that there's a but, which is essentially that the growth of inequality, both within the cultural sector and within society at large, is undermining that capacity. So the project kind of is a good news, bad news project in terms of we're able to demonstrate this connection. But from what we can tell, it's encountering a lot of headwind in terms of social inequality. Just in terms of how we got into this work, I mean, as I said, we've been doing it for 25 years. It really grew out of a debate that started during the 1990s when Republicans in Congress really tried very hard to shut down the NEA. Obviously something that could never happen again. That was supposed to be a joke for those who, because it was in Trump's budget this year was to shut down the NEA as well. In terms of my work here in the school, it was also a way to think about how arts and culture might fit into kind of an updated notion of social well-being. You know, historically, as many of the PhD students know, historically, social well-being has been defined in terms of fairly material goals. You know, food, shelter, what have you, and we haven't done that well at meeting those. But at the same time that we fail to meet those, the population as a whole has seen other things that they aspire to. So part of the project was to think about how arts and culture might be incorporated into a more comprehensive view of social well-being. You know, and I've already talked about the issue of social inequality and how that has affected the project. This last point is one that my friend Michael Katz pointed out to me, which is, you know, part of being an historian, and you know, my background is as an historian, is taking really fragmentary and terrible data and trying to make sense of this situation. And you know, I'll tell you, the arts and cultural sector kind of exceeds everyone in terms of fragmentary and incomplete data. You know, compared to social service, compared to the education sector, by and large, the arts and cultural sector is dominated by either informal or semi-formal entities, groups of artists, organizations that come and go. So there really are no comprehensive data sets that one can turn to find out what's going on in this sector. So that challenge kind of has motivated us all through the project. Essentially, there are three concepts. You know, the talk's on concepts and methods. So the three concepts I want to talk about are, first of all, the notion of a neighborhood cultural ecology. Second, the notion of social well-being. And finally, the third, the issue of civic engagement, which we see as the connection between arts and culture and the kind of social well-being outcomes that we're interested in. So neighborhood cultural ecology. This has really been an evolving concept in our work, which is, you know, if you look at most of the research on arts and culture, it's dominated by looking at either individual artists or individual organizations. Very little attention to the interactions between them, the linkages that join them. And one of the things that's come out to us through our research is that that kind of agglomeration effect, having a bunch of cultural entities in a particular neighborhood, makes a big difference, both within the cultural sector, because you know, artists like to hang out with other artists. You know, that was big insight. But also because of spillover effects in terms of broader elements of neighborhood well-being. I love this diagram because I did it in 1994, but essentially, you know, this is this point again, which is there's a lot of literature on kind of how within the cultural sector different entities want to interact, and that's, you know, a clear thing that comes out to us both through the quantitative and our qualitative research. But we've been also interested in the spillover effects that the concentration of cultural entities in a neighborhood can have on other dynamics within the neighborhood. And that's sort of been the core of our research. Okay, so that's neighborhood cultural ecology. I can't figure out, like I'm wherever I stand, I'm blocking people, right? So maybe I'll just wander so people will. There are some seats up here. Nadina, there's some seats up here if you guys want to come. Okay, so the second concept is social well-being. And this, we really got involved in this because of some work on what's called the capabilities approach, which a couple of names, Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, have been really leaders in terms of developing this area. In terms of our personal connection to it, one of our adjunct professors here at the school, Hans-Uwe Otto, has sort of, who's from Bielefeld in Germany, encouraged us to become involved in this. So essentially, the core notion here is that social justice can be measured by the ability of individuals to live a life that they have reason to value. So it's sort of a simple concept. I mean, you wouldn't know it was simple if you looked at the literature on it, but at its core, it's, I think, a very simple concept. What it's led to is an interest in what are those range of things, typically those capabilities, which are concrete opportunities that a person needs to live that kind of a life. And there's been a lot of work, both internationally on this overall. There's been a bit of a dispute. I put them here. There's a bit of dispute over whether one should actually draw up a list of those capabilities. Actually, Sen and Nussbaum have had kind of a polemic between them, with Sen arguing that the lists can't be imposed from outside, that people themselves have to decide what those are, and Nussbaum, the philosopher, saying, no, we can think that one through and come up with lists. And honestly, this is one of her lists. I think this list is like from 2003, and occasionally that list has changed over time. But you get the idea, and there's one thing if you look at this list from the standpoint of social science, which is that it's nothing but a bunch of measurement problems. I mean, how you measure these things are a challenge, and that's been, I think, one of the areas in which people have worked on this. So essentially, the literature within the capabilities approach has sort of gone in two directions. There's been a lot of work done on the theoretical and philosophical, like what do we mean by this? How would we define it? What's in or what's out in terms of talking about capabilities? Honestly, there's been an argument about whether it's plural or not, whether we should talk about the capability approach or the capabilities approach. So there are a lot of theoretical issues. The other area in which there's been work is in terms of how you would actually measure this stuff. And most of that work has been comparative at the national level. To what extent, I could quiz you on this, to what extent does Sweden have higher social well-being than the United States, or what have you? And you can imagine the US ends up kind of much lower on that list than it does on the list of GDP per capita because of these other aspects that are involved in that. In terms of our work, there was a influential study done by Sen and Joseph Stiglitz for the French president in 2009, that although, again, it's looking at things at the national level, in terms of its articulation of a set of dimensions that one could possibly measure, we use that as our starting point. Oh, and I wanted to point out, actually, on this slide that our friend Hans-Uwe Otto has this book coming out from Polity Press this fall about how the capability approach could be translated into policy approaches. So that's going on. In terms of our take on the Social Wellbeing Index, we essentially kind of added two things to it. First of all, we said rather than looking at this stuff at the national level, we thought we'd make a try at, can we drill this down to neighborhoods? Because after all, there's a lot in terms of the factors that influence one's ability of well-being that, are different here in this census tract than census tracts a half mile north or west of here. So this notion that you have kind of a national average is interesting in its own right, but if we're looking at people's actual individuals' ability to live a life they have reason to value, you need to look at that immediate ecological context. The other thing we've added is to see arts and culture, not surprisingly, as part of that list of capabilities. We've done that in two ways. On the one hand, thinking of it as on its own as being something that people have reason to value. So it's intrinsic value. But also how the presence of arts and cultural opportunities in a neighborhood might influence other dimensions of social well-being. So the third concept that has motivated the study is civic engagement. So the issue here is that arts and culture is going on at one place. How does that translate into broader notions of social well-being? And we see the ability of arts to stimulate broader forms of civic engagement as that connection. So as we've thought this through, we sort of see these three distinct dimensions of civic engagement that are relevant for the arts. And let me talk about those in turn. So the first one is didactic. The notion of the arts as a way of instructing or persuading people. This is a dimension of civic engagement that kind of has a very long history. I suspect religion knew how to do this long before arts and culture got into the act. But even if we look at the US history over the past century or so, there's a lot of examples of it. During the progressive period, there was the mounting of these civic pageants within a city, essentially with a large immigrant population, to bring everyone into kind of a notion of being part of some larger whole. And then certainly in terms of new social movements, you've seen a lot of use of this. I had to put up the photo of the Pussy Hats because I wanted to make the point that in terms of our definition of arts and culture, that we include the textile arts. So I wanted to make sure that was involved. Now, there's a drawback to this, which is, of course, that you can use it to persuade, but you don't necessarily use it to persuade to the truth. That certainly the use of arts and culture is in propaganda during the century and during the last year, is part of it. So there's been a philosophical debate about whether it's all that good that arts and culture is able to persuade people because they can persuade them to what's true and equally maybe to what's false. But that certainly is one pattern in terms of this. A second pattern really grows out of the literature on the public sphere. Jürgen Habermas and a lot of people who've used this stuff on this notion that opening up opportunities for dialogue and for public deliberation of issues is a critical aspect of civic engagement. And there are a lot of examples of this if we look around our work. I just put up two up here. One having to do the Asian Arts Initiative several years ago did an exhibit where they essentially tried to create new landscapes around the neighborhood as a way of stimulating discussion on how their neighborhood was changing over time. And then in the bottom left, that's a picture from Scribe Video, which for the past decade has been running the series where they send a crew made up of a filmmaker, neighborhood residents, and a humanities scholar to neighborhoods to essentially create a film about what's important about that neighborhood. And then they show these films, publicly, both. They show them down here, usually at International House, but then they also do these public performances in the neighborhood. It's interesting, Louis Messiah, who's the director at Scribe, started this, I think, with the notion that it would allow people to highlight the issues in their neighborhood that were undermining community, gentrification, displacement, what have you. But it turns out that most of these films, people in neighborhoods that if you look at them from the standpoint of their poverty rate or crime or what have you, would look distressed, the people want to make a film about how great their neighborhood is. So there's sort of this tension around this. But again, this is another element of civic engagement. And then the third is kind of leads back to our ecological focus. We're interested in places where arts has this impact on civic engagement, but not necessarily because of the intention of persuading or promoting dialogue, but just because the presence of cultural resources in a neighborhood allows people to connect more with other resources in the neighborhood. One of the interesting things in terms of arts and culture's unique role in this respect has to do with these different patterns of participation we found in terms of arts and culture in community, in terms of community arts participation in neighborhoods, which is that if you go into a neighborhood and you talk to the arts groups in that neighborhood and say, where do your participants come from? What you find is the overwhelming proportion of their participants don't necessarily live in that neighborhood. In contrast to if you talk to the Community Development Corporation or an anti-crime group, where by and large the people involved are going to just be in that neighborhood. Arts and culture sets up this situation where you are both increasing civic engagement within the neighborhood, but you're also increasing bonds between that neighborhood and other parts of the city. So from the standpoint of civic engagement, we think arts and culture has a different perspective on that. So if you take these three conceptual concepts I've thrown out so far, I think you can come up with a different formulation of what we mean by culture and social justice. So on the one hand, we're talking about a notion of social justice that we can articulate in terms of multiple dimensions and then actually articulate in a way that we could actually measure. And that we have a notion of the arts' impact on civic engagement that isn't just restricted to groups that say they want to change something in the neighborhood or they want to promote discussion, but looks at the entire cultural sector. So we think if we do this, we end up, first of all, looking at a much wider range of cultural practices within the neighborhood than just people who are saying their purpose is to do change, bring about social change. And secondly, as I said, it sets us up in a situation where we could actually translate these conceptual ideas into research that we can actually do, which, Sue and I have only been doing for 23 years. So I hope we've demonstrated that you can do the research because we've been doing it too long. So essentially, what do we do in New York? You probably know that New York's a really big city, 8 million people plus. So essentially, we developed what we call a cultural asset index by measuring a variety of different cultural assets at the neighborhood level. We've looked at nonprofit cultural organizations. We've looked at for-profit cultural firms, artists, and finally cultural participants. Then we've used other people's data to develop a multidimensional measure of social well-being. We ended up with 10 dimensions to that. And then finally, we supplement that with interviewing in the neighborhood, especially during a very hot summer in 2016, with a focus on a couple of neighborhoods in particular, Fort Greene in Brooklyn and East Harlem in Upper Manhattan. So let me go on. So let me talk about cultural assets. As I've mentioned, we look at these four different types of cultural assets. And I guess I'll go through, I should tell you one of the reasons I was sort of excited about doing this project. This is probably like the 15th or 20th presentation I've done since we started this project. But typically, I'm assigned 12 minutes focusing on like what are my headlines, because this is New York. Everything goes by New York minutes. So I was sort of excited that one of the opportunities here was actually to walk through how we actually do this. So I want to spend a little time of that. So we do those 4 measures, and then we combine them into a single measure of cultural assets that scales the 4 of them together. And again, we are always testing our data in terms of our interviewing, in terms of whether what we're finding makes sense to people who are actually living in the neighborhoods. So let me walk through this and talk a little bit about how we gathered the data. So as I said, the cultural sector is dominated by informal and semi-formal groups. So there's no real single listing you can go to for all the nonprofit providers in town. So we combine data from 4 or 5 different sources, places that got grants either from the city or from a foundation, groups that have registered as nonprofits that we could pick up, and a variety of other sources. I'm blanking on one, Sue. I had it on the previous slide. Oh yeah, Borough Arts Council. So that was really helpful in terms of smaller groups. So each borough in the city has its own arts council, and they're able to give grants not only to kind of official nonprofits, but also through conduits to much smaller groups. So we put all those together, and whereas, say, the city is giving grants to maybe 11 or 1,200 groups, we ended up with 4,700 groups across the entire city. Now, I should orient people. How many New Yorkers? A few. Okay, so this is Manhattan. If you arrive at Penn Station, you'll be somewhere over here on the west side. So that's Manhattan. And then you've got what are called the outer boroughs going to the other 4 of those. In terms of the arts and culture, as we were measuring things, you can see sections of Brooklyn. This is Brooklyn Heights, Fort Greene, Prospect Park. These neighborhoods had really striking concentrations in terms of these. And then a few neighborhoods in Queens along the 7 train going out to Corona Flushing Park. And then you can see relative concentrations of nonprofits across the rest of the city. One of the things is, okay, that was one map. I'm going to show you 4 other maps, and they all kind of look the same. So maybe, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we gathered the data. So this is for-profit cultural entities. We didn't sweat it out as much as we did around nonprofits on this. We used a proprietary data set of for-profit businesses in the city. And we took that list, and it's kind of a dirty list. So you have to get rid of duplicates. You have to, you have to figure out which are the real photographers and which are the, well, I guess, people who used to develop. I guess there aren't film developers. You have to figure out who actually does video stuff and who's actually doing pornography. It's sort of easy to tell those apart. But so there's a range. There's a range of things. But the one thing I want to emphasize here is the kind of range of groups we like to include in terms of thinking about arts and culture. So we're talking about galleries and kind of high-profile groups that people would think, but we're also talking about, at the neighborhood level, music stores and craft shops that also may be engaged in different dimensions of social well-being. And once again, you can see, though, that the pattern, is quite slanted towards Manhattan and a few neighborhoods in terms of Queens and Brooklyn. Okay, this is artists. I don't know how far to go into this. Essentially, historically, actually, we've used lists of fellowships, artist fellowships, as a way of figuring out where artists were living across the city, because we were trying to stay away from the census data, because obviously you're only picking up people whose main way of earning a living is through an arts occupation. But this terrible thing has happened in terms of our research. It's called the internet. You've probably heard of it. But essentially, groups don't mail anymore. They email. And if you email, you don't really need to know anyone's physical address. So if your whole project is based on spatial concentrations, you really need those addresses. So it's been a problem. We really couldn't find a set of lists around artists that could really give us what we thought of as kind of a comprehensive profile of where things looked across the entire city. So we actually went back to using census data, but even doing that, we kind of ended up with a headache, which is the aggregate census data, which where you're looking at either census tracts or block groups or geographies, doesn't identify just artist occupation. It kind of goes like artists are thrown in with like personal trainers at gyms. There's like a whole set of design and artist occupations that are in one category. So we couldn't just use the census tract or the block group data. The public use microdata that all the PhD students are at this point having flashbacks to terrible moments during their first year here, does tell you individual artist occupation. So we figured out a method to but that data doesn't have a very specific geography. It has these pumas, which are like much bigger. So we figured out a way of using the two kinds of data together to get a better sense of where the artists were in the city. And as you could see, when we did all that work and came back to it, it turned out that the artists lived in Manhattan below 125th Street and in Brooklyn and Queens near the river. So again, it's a particular pattern. And the final dimension we were looking at in terms of arts and culture was cultural participation. This took forever. If I never have to do this again, I'll be a happy guy. Essentially, our method is to go to a sample of cultural organizations and say, who comes to your events? Who are your members? Who are your single ticket buyers? What have you? We then took all of those lists and aggregated them. Well, I just skipped over like 4 months of the work, which is, of course, that a lot of groups don't necessarily have the data. Did Antisocial, what was the name of that group? That was my favorite name, at least. It's like the Antisocial Theater Group or something. They had like 25 names for us, but so we ranged from that to Brooklyn Academy of Music, which has significantly more than a couple of dozen names. So we take all those lists and we put them together and then geocode the data to get a sense of, I would say, really a first cut on a sense of where participants are across the city. And again, it actually is a little different. There are a number of neighborhoods that weren't part of kind of the organizational profile that actually pop out in terms of these data. So we put all those four together, and then we create, as I mentioned, a cultural asset index using scaling procedures to bring the four of those together. And that essentially, as you can see, it pretty much reflects what we were seeing in the first four maps. The green areas are the sections with the highest concentration of cultural assets, and these red areas are the areas with the fewest. Those of you who kind of have a sense of social geography of New York, you can get a feel for kind of which are the neighborhoods that do and don't have resources. Let me say a word about informal arts, because it's going to come up at some point, which is there are no cultural deserts in New York City. In fact, that every neighborhood has cultural assets. What we're trying to measure in this study is where are their resources being brought in or developed within the neighborhood. So there certainly is a whole level of informal activity ranging, in terms of participation from free events where we really aren't able to track those, to informal, performances that are happening across the city all the time. So there's a level you just can't get to, especially if you're trying to do the whole city in 2 years. You know, in fact, in other studies, we've been able to focus on, say, 3 or 4 neighborhoods in Philadelphia over a 3-year period, and you can actually start to feel like you're penetrating a little deeper in terms of the cultural life of those neighborhoods. But that just wasn't in the cards in terms of this. All right, so here's the shock. Cultural resources in New York City are really unequally distributed. These are the richest 20% of census tracts, I think, maybe block groups, in the city, and the level of cultural assets they have, and these are our other neighborhoods. So we saw this as like the first finding that we wanted to impress on people. And I'll talk about like translating this stuff into talking to policy audiences later. One of the things that's more distressing to us really couldn't come out of the New York data, where we only had data at one point in time. But in Philadelphia, we've been doing this since the 90s. And one of the things we've discovered is that that correlation between economic standing and cultural assets has actually increased quite dramatically in this city. That neighborhoods, low income and African American and Latino neighborhoods in Philadelphia that in the 90s had significant number of cultural assets have seen those assets decline quite dramatically as we moved into the 2000 teens. That had implications in terms of how we thought about this notion of neighborhood cultural ecology. Because we didn't want to do a study that just said, well, the only neighborhoods where cultural ecology matter are like Soho and Brooklyn Heights. So we started thinking about the fact that, you know, if we think about economic distress as kind of a barrier to developing one's cultural assets, that maybe there's a set of neighborhoods in the city that have more cultural assets than we would expect given their economic standing. So maybe I walk through that again. So essentially, you know, for the statisticians, which I don't want to cause terrible flashbacks on that either, but you know, essentially, if you control it statistically, are there low-income neighborhoods that, compared to other low-income neighborhoods, have relatively high number of cultural assets? And we see that we call those civic clusters because they tend not to be generated by commercial activity, but more by people living in the neighborhood, generating cultural activities and institutions in those. So we end up with kind of a map of where the cultural clusters. Yeah.
Can I ask a question on the prior graph? It's very striking, the concentration at the top. So you could say that the good news in some way is that if you're not in the top, it doesn't affect you too much. Any income level has somewhat similar level of activity. So
Yeah.
can you speak more to that fact, and why do you think it's so concentrated only?
Well, New York, I mean, if I compare it to Philadelphia and other cities where we've done this work, you actually find a much more straightforward kind of linear decline. New York, you know, is New York. It's got the theater, it's got the recording industry, it's got all these industries that are really concentrated, especially in lower Manhattan. If we go here, what we call these high market clusters in lower Manhattan and a few neighborhoods in Brooklyn, just, you know, you throw a rock and you hit an artist. I mean, there's just, not that I'm advocating that, but essentially there's a lot of cultural assets in these neighborhoods. You can't walk down the street without running into them. So there's a concentration that I think is, if I put my urban studies hat on, what I would say is that these world cities, these global cities, have a very different cultural profile because they don't just have neighborhood cultural assets, they have international cultural assets as well. So I think, I think you're right to point that out. Although again, it's a scaling thing. Like if we remove those, if we drop those, we'd probably find that there was a correlation there as well. It's a good point, and it is something that's quite distinctive in terms of New York compared to other cities in which we've done work. So anyway, this is our notion of cultural clusters. So we have these market clusters where you just have these high concentration of all these cultural assets that we saw as we were going through the maps. And then we have these civic clusters where they're low-income neighborhoods that are doing better than we would predict given their economic standing. And those are important to us, first of all, because you can go to them and you can see that something's going on in those neighborhoods that isn't necessarily going on in other low-income neighborhoods. And because it's a way to get beyond kind of that New Yorker's view of, the New Yorker view of the country where everything just happens in Manhattan. All right, so let me talk about social well-being. As I mentioned, in contrast to, better wrap up. In contrast to our measures around cultural assets, the social well-being, we were dependent on data that's available. Essentially, these first four dimensions you can get from nationally available data sources. So you could actually do those consistently across the country. These other ones, some of them are available. I mean, like crime, we were dealing with the mayor's office of operations, and it was like every time you mentioned NYPD, like everyone sort of started shaking because no one I think actually wanted to call up and say where were the data. But then suddenly one day, about a year into the project, the data just showed up. So it was magic. Anyway, so it varies from dimension to dimension. Economic well-being, clearly, which includes measures around income, educational attainment, labor force participation. It's kind of a predictable map of the city where you can see the high poverty parts of the city and the more affluent parts of the city. And there are a variety of dimensions of social well-being that are highly correlated with economic well-being. So for example, this is health. This is based on data we were able to get on birth outcomes, child abuse and neglect rates of they call them indicated. Is that national language? Indicated cases of abuse and neglect. And then there's a community health survey that gives us data on the incidence of things like hypertension, diabetes, and what have you. So we aggregated those, and you can see the map looks quite similar to the map of economic well-being. And the same is true around personal security, which is essentially based on the crime data. There's a story here, but I'm going to skip over it. But then there's a whole set of measures that don't necessarily match right up with economic well-being. So this is a measure of ethnic and economic diversity, in which we sort of look at the extent to which the neighborhood kind of includes more than a kind of its distribution over economic status is like broader, and the same in terms of the presence of more than one ethnic group in a particular neighborhood. And it stands out quite distinctive. One of the things I really enjoyed is, like, in terms of the environmental amenities, this is like an area which I've never done any work. So I was, I never thought I'd end up doing research using satellite pictures, but, so it's sort of a kick. It's amazing. They are able to tell you about land use down to a square meter across the entire city. So you can see where we use it sort of dumbly for just trees and grass, which we thought of as good, but it's quite remarkable, I think. And then we were interested, Eric Kleinenberg did this book, Heat Wave, in which he showed the extent to which the risks around exposure to heat kind of had this very strong correlation with economic status and produced, also with mortality during the summer. So we're able to get these infrared radiation. So you can see like here's Central Park. It's cooler. There's a really hot day in August, I think, and there's Prospect Park. Okay, and that's sort of environmental amenities. So we take all of these 10 dimensions, and then we, again, use cluster analysis to say, can we find patterns among those? And you end up with, essentially, we ended up with these 4 clusters, these kind of astronomically affluent neighborhoods in lower Manhattan, the green, which are essentially kind of more standard economically affluent neighborhoods, a set of concentrated disadvantaged neighborhoods in Brooklyn, Queens, Upper Manhattan, and Bronx, and even a few neighborhoods in Staten Island. And then finally, this group of what we identified as diverse and struggling neighborhoods. We think this group is really interesting. We think they kind of represent a new urban reality that's kind of emerging demographically, characterized by, on the one hand, economic challenge, but also a whole set of dimensions of diversity. These are the scores across the dimensions. Just to focus on the diverse and challenged neighborhoods, you see, on the one hand, on certain measures, they're doing terribly. I mean, their housing burden, so the higher the score, the more, essentially, the more you're spending on housing and the more overcrowding you're experiencing. And these neighborhoods are almost as bad off as the concentrated disadvantaged neighborhoods. They have higher rates. These are rates of non-insurance, so they have higher rates of not having health insurance. And they have they're significantly challenged in terms of economic well-being. At the same time, there's a set of these non-economic measures where these neighborhoods are doing really significantly better. I mean, they do better in health. They're kind of in the middle in terms of cultural assets. They're significantly higher than the concentrated disadvantage and somewhat lower than the advantaged neighborhoods in terms of school outcomes. And their crime rates are really below average and kind of roughly comparable to neighborhoods. And of course, they're very diverse. So we saw this as a really interesting, and we think there's essentially an overlap between what we're identifying as these civic clusters and what we're identifying as these neighborhoods that are economically and ethnically challenged. Okay, so then the final part of the quantitative work was to look at these together. Particularly, we were interested in low-income neighborhoods, low and moderate income neighborhoods. So we're looking at the bottom 40% of neighborhoods. We're controlling for economic standing, the proportion of Latinos and the proportion of African Americans in the neighborhood. And then we're looking at the relationship between cultural assets and our measures of personal security, school effectiveness, and health. And those ended up being statistically significant relationships. Again, as I said, the story we're trying to tell has a but in between it. So we're finding these relationships, but we think that there's a lot of headwind in terms of culture's capacity to do this because of social inequality. This is just some summary in terms of what we found in our qualitative work in terms of talking to people. We found sort of 3 major themes there. The role of arts and culture in terms of social connection, its role in terms of political and cultural voice. I have to put our best interview. This is a great group of guys, but actually it's not all guys. This is Juan and Julia Gutierrez, who run this group LP21. And in terms of articulating a vision of arts as providing voice for a group that sees themselves as marginal, they get number 1 for me. And then finally, kind of the use of arts and culture in terms of the use of public space. And we did this work in Fort Greene. Fort Greene Park is on the one hand surrounded by $1 million brownstones. On the other hand, across the northern tier, it has a set of public housing development. So it's a contested terrain in that respect. We ended up with kind of 3 strategies that came out of this. One, focus on these neighborhoods with very low number of cultural assets, that this seemed like a policy priority. A second, which is more conjectural, is could we use these civic clusters I talked about as kind of points of strength in terms of improving conditions in surrounding neighborhoods. And then finally, strengthening the networks both within and between neighborhoods. This was some work we finished over the summer around, we had a data set of 8,000 connections between different arts groups, arts groups and other groups in which they worked. And we found two very distinctive patterns, one which I'd almost describe as sort of colonial, where there are low-income neighborhoods and all of the groups in the neighborhood that are making connections are essentially schools and senior centers, and they're connected with cultural organizations far away who kind of come in once a year to do a performance. And then but in our civic cluster neighborhoods, we found a much more complex connection where there are more connections within and outside the neighborhood, more connections between arts groups, more connections with a broader set of groups. So policy impacts, let me finish up with that because I've gone on too long already. So our findings have, been picked up by the mayor's administration in terms of they do this one NYC report, and the cultural section picked up on our work. Again, in terms of emphasizing this notion around unequal distribution of cultural resources, and that's something the city had to take on. And then, as I mentioned, the cultural plan came out this summer, and again, we were happy to see that they were picking up on some of our findings in terms of that. I should point out, this was our second favorite interviewee, Meredith Almeida at the Myrtle Avenue Business Improvement District in Brooklyn. That was before I knew she had such a gorgeous family. It was a great interview. So that's it. So we sort of end up with this idea that arts and culture is a big stew, and we can't really say on 2 years' work if arts and culture is like a central ingredient or just a spice. This actually comes, Juan Gutierrez talked about cumin, like thinking about arts and culture as the cumin in community life that kind of adds the spice to it. So we sort of ended with that as our idea. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us, and please give Professor Stern a